everybody. Today we're going to talk about controlling human population growth. So we've talked about already how the human population is growing exponentially, and the UN is predicting that it's going to grow to up to around 11 billion people by 2050. Now that depends on a lot of different things. There are lots of different factors that could make it grow a little bit faster or a little bit slower than that. But there's no question that we're growing exponentially, and other populations always switch to that logistic growth after a while once they hit the carrying capacity. So that's the big question, is what's going to happen to us? When do we hit that? Is that something that we need to be worried about? So there are basically three different scenarios, but either way, our population is going to continue to grow. So it's just a question of how much it grows. Now, what's the problem with this? Why is it an issue if we keep growing? Well, the biggest problem is, as far as environmentalists are concerned, as your population goes up, the amount that you degrade the environment goes up. You use more resources, and you tend to create much more pollution and things like that. Another problem is there is a correlation to hunger and population size. So generally, the larger population you have, the less resources are available per person. Hunger becomes more of an issue. So in this country, hopefully you are experiencing food security, which means you know where your next meal is coming from. You're not worried about going hungry. But many countries, and even people within the US, they're experiencing food insecurity. They don't know if that's going to happen. They're living under constant threat of starvation and famine. And that, of course, causes all kinds of additional stresses to the population in terms of the way society interacts. If people don't have enough food, rates of crime and things like that go up. Also, larger populations tend to lead to more persistent poverty and more division between the upper and lower classes. They can lead to economic stagnation. So higher population economies tend to not do as well as those in lower population countries. The urban areas can start to deteriorate and break down because they just can't support that many people. And of course, there's all kinds of health issues and epidemics and things like that that go along with having a lot of people living in a small area. So if you just take a look at this map for a second, this red area here is the places in the world that you have the most people who are experiencing that food insecurity, where they're not getting enough to eat, they're malnourished, and that's going to be a major factor in their lives. And you can see that these are focused in some major regions here, and it's no coincidence that a lot of these regions happen to have very high populations. Now, it's not a absolutely direct correlation in that it doesn't mean that just because you have a high population you're going to have a high rate of hunger. In fact, you can see that China does not in comparison to many of these other countries, but there is a relationship there. So there's two hypotheses that predict how the economy will be affected by population growth. The first hypothesis says that the more your population grows, the more economic development you will have, and the more technological innovation you will have as a result of that. So this basically says that lots of people are good for the economy. The second hypothesis is basically the opposite. Rapid population growth lowers economic development, lowers technological innovation. And from the current data, it seems that this might be more of the case. And just one example of that is if you look at the debt in developing countries versus developed countries, you do have much higher debt in developed countries. Of course, you have much higher economy in the first place. But if you start to control the population, then you see that debt level go down, because when you have a larger population you need to provide more infrastructure. That means the government needs more money and things like that in the first place. If you look at this particular graph here, this is in a developing country. As the population goes up, the economy is in general going up, and we can measure that in terms of debt, but eventually it starts to go down again. So we're going to look at a number of case studies here that deal with how different countries have tried to control their population. I want you to look for some similarities in each of them. So I want you to take a minute and read through each of these, pause on each of them, make sure you understand the different ways of controlling populations that have been applied here. And I want you to look for those similarities in there. So we're starting with China, and China, of course, is probably the most famous example of population control because it's caused a lot of uproar because it goes against many social systems and ethical beliefs. But they've put in some very severe penalties to prevent people from having children, and they've actually been very, very successful at controlling their population. But obviously, at what cost? India is another group that has had some mixed success with population control. So take a minute and read through this. So India's total fertility rates have dropped. Their population is not growing at the rate it used to be, but they still haven't gotten it back to more of a zero growth pattern yet. Mexico is another one that has had its own set of struggles, and it's one that can impact us greatly based on how close our borders are to Mexico. And Uganda, this is a country that's actually trying to grow its population instead of decrease it because it's been so impacted by HIV and AIDS. Uganda's HIV prevalence has gone down significantly. You can see that at the very height of this, it was about 29-30% of their population who was infected with HIV, and now it's actually been reduced down to 7.2%. So that's a significant change, and they've seen their population start to bounce back because of that. Thailand, another fairly successful form of population control. In Europe, we have the opposite population problem. They have a negative growth rate because they have such low fertility rates. What this does in your age structure diagram is it means that less and less people are of reproductive age and more people are elderly. And this can have a bunch of effects that are economic and otherwise. So you have less government revenue, you have fewer workers, you have less entrepreneurs starting new businesses. You are probably less likely to develop new technologies if you don't have that many people in the workforce. And if you're paying more pensions and more healthcare costs for those older people, then you're probably increasing the public deficit. So pronatalists are predicting that having these large numbers of elderly people are going to impact the economy negatively, but there are opponents out there that say that these are still an asset. These people are still contributing to society and still putting money into the economy, and therefore are not causing a economic loss. So when we look at problems of population growth, we have to come back to this original diagram that population changes depend on these four things. And we have to see, okay, where can we impact these things? Well, we can impact how many people die, but obviously there's a big ethical dilemma there. That's probably not something we should be trying to increase. We can change laws as far as immigration and emigration into individual countries. However, unless we find somewhere else, another planet or such to colonize, you're probably not going to have anybody emigrating from Earth, and hopefully not anybody coming in either. So that really just leaves us with births, and that's really what population control winds up being all about, is reducing the birth rate, and particularly the total fertility rate. So total fertility rate is typically high for a number of reasons, especially in those developing countries. So first of all, there are often in many cultures very specific roles for genders, and they're often unequal. Women don't usually have as many opportunities, especially for education, as males, and that causes the fertility rate to go up. You also tend to have higher fertility rates when you have high mortality rates. You have to make up the amount of people that are lost. The younger people get married, the higher the fertility rate tends to be. So for instance, in Pakistan, the average age of a woman at marriage is 17, and the total fertility rate is 3.6. In Denmark, the average age to get married is 30, and the total fertility rate is 1.9. So there's a significant correlation there. And work expectations of children are another thing. If you need them to help you work on the farm, if children are going and earning money for their families and factories, then people are going to have more children. Religious beliefs. Many people don't believe in contraception or any form of birth control, and that again, would play into this fertility rate. And in general, less education equals higher fertility rates. And this is especially for women, but it's also true for men, as you can see in this graph here. A lot of those developing countries have very high illiteracy rates, so people aren't being educated, and the higher the illiteracy rate, usually the higher the population goes along with it. So this particular graph, what it's showing you is the blue bars are the percent of married women using modern methods of contraception. The red bars are showing you the total fertility rate. So you can see as contraception use goes up, the fertility rate goes down, and that is good if you're trying to control your population size. So when we look at how we're going to achieve this zero population growth and get our population to the point where it has stabilized, there's lots of different things we can do, and you saw all of these in your different case studies before. But they all basically boil down to three major things. So the most ethical and effective ways to slow population growth are basically these three things. First of all, invest in family planning and of course the education to allow people to do that. Reduce poverty. So obviously that's a very complicated issue because it deals with a lot of different economic systems. And the third one, and in many cases what's proven to be the most important, is to elevate the status of women and to give women other options so that their only role in life is not just to have children. There are many different things that they can do. So all of this has played into what we call Millennium Development Goals that were developed by the UN at their Millennium Summit in 2000. There were 189 countries that came together to write these 8 goals. So take a minute and record these goals. I want you to notice that many of these goals overlap with these last 3 things that we were talking about. And that's not a coincidence. A lot of these goals are just in general for the benefit of everyone living in the world, but they will also help to control the population, which will lead to a better quality of life. Achieving all of these goals is going to look a little bit different depending on what type of country you live in, however. So if you actually look at the world population, most of our areas of growth are those developing countries. So that's where most of this change needs to happen. So all of these things can help to change the populations of those particular countries. And again, going back and focusing on these 3 major things in those countries will help to stabilize their populations. However, there's lots of things that our highly developed countries like us can be doing to help this as well. And a lot of that comes in terms of financial support, since we tend to have the more stable economies as well. And in particular, some things that we should be doing on a daily basis are also making sure that we're sustainably using our resources. Because in these countries, as we talked about earlier in the year, overconsumption is really the bigger problem rather than overpopulation. So both of those factors, overconsumption and overpopulation, are actually what come together to cause us to run out of resources. So doing things like engaging in voluntary simplicity or downsizing, basically getting by with just barely what you need rather than having such a materialistic life, is something that can really help to address this problem. So this is something that going forward is going to be probably one of the biggest political issues in your generation. It's something that we're definitely going to need to deal with. And it's something that's really at the root of all the other environmental issues that we talk about throughout the year. So it's super important to understand what's going on with the human population and how we can possibly address that. So I want you to really take some time and think about this. And start to apply it to the different things that we see for the rest of the year. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.